In this interview, I speak with Alicia Crosby. Alicia Crosby is a justice educator, activist, and minister whose work addresses the spiritual, systemic, and interpersonal harm people experience. Through her teaching, writing, speaking, and space curation, Alicia helps individuals, communities, and institutions explore and unpack topics related to identity, justice, journey, and intersectional equity. This native New Yorker channels her creativity into her writing, speaking, and work with nonprofits, educational institutions, corporate entities, faith groups, and communities around the United States. Enjoy. Why, hello. Today I'm talking to my friend Alicia, and I've been looking forward to this. And you kind of interviewed me for something recently, so this is kind of fun to kind of flip around to the other side of the table, as it were.
I know, I'm on the other side of the microphone. I'm super pumped to be here with you today, Ash. I've been looking forward to this too.
Great. I'm just going to dive in, and this is part of a project about how queerness and faith interact.
Okay.
And particularly for the course that I'm doing, and I'm making this public afterwards for people, about the way in which the stories that we tell about ourselves change things. And two stories that I feel like come in conflict a lot have to do with faith, anything to do with any sort of sexual ethics, but queerness in particular. Those two things end up smashing into each other in people's lives and causing a lot of tension. But I want to start by just kind of asking about your faith background, your upbringing, how you came up.
Yeah. So I think at this point in life, depending on the context, I would use one of two terms to describe myself. In those where it's like, where I have to be a bit more censored, I say that I'm ecumenical, and others I say that I'm ecumenically promiscuous because I've been around. Shout out to Kelly Nikendeha for that one. But so for me, faith starts in the Missionary Baptist Church, which is a traditionally Black church in New York. So that's where I started. And when I say I started, shortly after birth, like I was in somebody's pew. I'm a PK, I'm a pastor's kid. And so that was very much a place of like my formation. So a lot of what honestly even holds meaning for me now comes from that space. It was a tiny storefront church that would have first and second service a few times a month, which is something that not everybody does with sister churches across the tri-state area, so New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut actually. These churches would come together once or twice a month to have fellowship. And a lot of my upbringing was formed by these folks who migrated from the South to the North, which is part of also my family history, right? And so that's where I got my start. But in, I want to say late elementary, junior high, my dad, my parents had divorced, and I was living with my dad, and my dad actually became a pastor of a church. I can't remember the denomination of the church right now. It might have been a Methodist church that they just brought in a Baptist pastor, but we were there for a bit. And then after we left that space, we ended up in a non-denominational church, AKA we ended up in in Black evangelicalism, because that's really what it was. When I went to college, I went to an Anglican church, which is actually really interesting because this church broke off from the rest of the Episcopal Church because they were LGBTQ supporting by that point. And the church was an Anglican church, and it declaredly so on because of them being anti-LGBTQ, which was my sentiment back then. We'll talk about repression in a little bit. But after that, I ended up in a white Pentecostal space that broke off into another like kind of evangelical space. Ended up working and worshiping in an evangelical megachurch for a little bit. Hung out with the Nazarenes for like 3 years after that. Kicked it with the Reformed kids for a spell. Evangelical Covenant. Went to a Methodist church for a little bit when I moved to Chicago in my late 20s. And actually still have a really good relationship with a number of the ministers there. But I was there while attending a Catholic school. Shout out to the Jesuits.
I was wondering if you were going to get that branch of Christianity in there somewhere.
We're going to get it. We were going to get it. And then my last sort of like foray, not so much with church per se, but again, education. I just graduated from Duke Divinity. So I was at another Methodist institution, which I kind of found to be quite interesting. If you follow me online, you know how I feel about Duke. Not positive, but all of that being said,
lots of interesting tales.
Oh Jesus, it's a mess. But at this point, you know, by this point in my journey, right, like me ended up at Duke, even with me being in Loyola, for my first master's degree, like I realized, you know, I wasn't someone who spiritually thrived in like congregational settings in the way that others do. And so I started exploring like what it meant to like live out my faith outside of the institutional constructs. And that's where I flourish. So I'm one of those like Christians who doesn't really go to church other than if I like preach or if a friend is preaching. It's just not my jam. And like I'm far enough along in my healing journey because some of that was pain, but I'm far enough in my healing journey where I can see the utility and the beauty in it for other people. But I know that I just spiritually thrive elsewhere, and that's on the outside.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, did you have guilt to work through with that?
I did. I definitely did have guilt. And a lot of it honestly was imposed by other people. I have always had like kind of an interesting relationship with scripture, right? So like I'd always ask questions around it. I'm like a professional question asker. Like literally I do facilitation. And so I ask questions for a living. But like that sense of being inquisitive has been a part of me since I was really young. And so when things just didn't add up for me or just didn't feel right to me, I'd go to a place of question. And that includes in my faith. And so I remember like just kind of having this time sitting with that scripture that folks like to throw at people who aren't in congregational spaces about forsaking the fellowship of like believers, right? And like not doing that. And then I was like, but I'm not forsaking the fellowship. Like here are all the ways that I'm fellowshipping that have nothing to do with this particular construct that is comfortable and edifying for you. So I'm going to go do what works for me while still doing this whole fellowship thing in a way that makes sense and like lets me and God commune in a way where I don't feel like all this extra baggage.
Mm-hmm. I have so many questions along that trajectory, but it's off the focus here. So I'm going to have to like store those up for later.
We can talk offline about that.
Yeah, because I'm in a similar situation where like, I mean, I think from the age of 14 until like 5 years ago, I could count on one hand the number of times I didn't go to church on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm like, and it's not because of, and it isn't because of trauma. Like I'll go visit evangelical churches with my mother-in-law, and I'm like, I don't feel any anxiety at all. It's just I'm in a different spot. But anyways, save that for later.
We will. And like, so before we move on, I just want to like just like acknowledge like what you just said. Not everybody, it's not about trauma for everyone. And even for me, I mean, the trauma is something I came to reckon with later, but honestly, it was just the construction of the service. Yeah. Like I needed a lot more human connection than I was getting there. And so this whole, like someone's on a dais and they lecture at you and you're not really interacting with the people around you. That was the thing that like led me out of the space where I'm like, oh wait, and here are all these other things that are traumatic that happen.
Mm-hmm.
So
for sure. Yeah. Lectures and singing isn't like, singing karaoke, singing around a fire with friends. Yes, yes.
That's communal. It's communal.
It's communal. It's not this sort of particular structure. That doesn't have to be this way.
It doesn't.
It's not any formal definition of church that most people use.
Mm-mm.
but it is functional. Yeah. Anyways, but I think that's a good point. There's this. So why I don't really think of myself as post-evangelical, even though I used to be one and I'm not anymore, is because my shift wasn't reacting to trauma predominantly. I didn't deconstruct. I moved deeper. Is how I tend to how it felt to me, and I think that does. Just to wrap it into the queer thing, I think that's part of this thing too. Like there are different ways that when people kind of are realizing that their gender, sexuality, different areas of identity are in conflict with what the assumptions are with church or particular forms of Christianity. Like, yes, that can cause trauma, which it does, and we can react it. But there are other queer folks not engaging well in good church spaces isn't just about feeling pain.
No, I mean, it's literally about being queer. It's about being and embodying a sexual and gender ethic that subverts. And so much of what happens within a lot of traditional religious spaces within the church put people in boxes that just don't work for us. So whether it's that you're told that a certain relational ethic is for you, right? And like that you should only be in monogamous relationships that lead to marriage, and they have to be between, you know, a cisgender man and a cis woman, like that doesn't work for all of us. And queerness is about pushing back at those things and subverting and finding other ways to construct family and to pursue love and desire. And it's definitely a political, ethical stance, but it's also a deeply spiritual one. Because going back to that family thing, I mean, like ultimately, like that's the thing that matters most, right? Or should matter is like, is the love of God, is the family that God calls us into. And so that means that like in the same ways that we can accept that families need, or that love can come in these different ways, right? We can talk about family love and romantic love and friend love. Well, there are other forms of love and being that can come in the family of God because there's great diversity here.
So, and I'm glad the direction you're going, because the way that one of the things that I benefited from before coming out. So I came out when I was 45. Like, and it wasn't like I had a secret for the first 40. Well, I did, but it was a secret for me too. Like, it kind of dawned on me. But I had for years like been part of this journey where I was starting to like shift away from this sort of anti-LGBTQ kind of evangelicalism, and then I was like, well, you know, these people need God's love and their sins aren't worse than mine, like that kind of thing. And then like, well, maybe everyone can be at the table. And then it's like, wait a second, I feel like there's gifts that my trans and queer friends bring, and I'm hungry for whatever they're sharing a perspective. And so that kind of started baptizing my imagination. And so whenever I was able to kind of come to some realizations about that, for me, it felt like a very spiritual thing. It wasn't just like, and it didn't feel like I was violating. By that point, I didn't feel like there was any violation of my core convictions at all. In fact, it was me moving deeper. And so it felt like a conversion, which is not how most people would necessarily think about it. And I'm wondering, like, with your journey, like, so I heard in your story, like, you grew up in contexts that were not friendly to this. But in your ecumenical promiscuity, you encounter different spaces.
Absolutely.
Where it was accepted at varying levels. So what was that like? What was going on inside you throughout all this process?
So honestly, I wasn't in an wholly LGBTQ affirming space until probably I reached at Methodist Church in Chicago. And so I was like 28 when I landed there. Like everywhere else either was pretty like vehemently anti-LGBT to the point where it would be like message from off the stage, like being like gay is a sin, blah, 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 blah. Or queerness was like vilified in other ways through like these like hyper gendered, you know, expectations coming out of sermons and conferences and what have you. But like my journey, I don't know, like my journey was an interesting one in that the conservatism that was in these church spaces was also like in my home. And so I, you know, so what's interesting is like when you look back, you see bits of your life where you're like, oh, okay, these things were like signs, and perhaps maybe I was not straight, right? Like I had those pretty early on. And probably by the time I was like, definitely by the time I was 15, I was like, yeah, no, like I just my attraction is a lot more expansive than I'm told it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember trying to have that conversation I had that conversation with some of my friends, and they were all like, good for you. And then I had the conversation with my dad, and I have my dad's consent to share this, because we've talked about this a lot over the years. And he's just like, no, but you're like, no, like this isn't a thing we believe. This isn't a thing we can do. And so, like, I repressed for years. And so it took me another, let me do math. Probably it took me like another 13, 14 years before I could come out to myself fully, because of how constrictive the religious space that I was formed in. And there was nowhere around me that let me know that it was possible for you to be an LGBTQ Christian. It just wasn't a part of the world that I lived in. Even if I saw people who were like hella queer, like really visibly queer, like they were still in a place of repression. And so it just wasn't allowable where I grew up.
So is this the sort of thing where you would have seen it as like, I have this inner sinful struggle that I have to keep things locked down, like you're a werewolf, and like whenever the urges come, you have to lock yourself in the shackle of the werewolf in the basement, kind of a scenario, just to keep it from going out and wreaking havoc?
Kind of. And it's also like the reframing, right? So I would see women who like I would thought were attractive. It's just like, oh my gosh, like if I was into girls, I would like totally say that she's cute. It's just like, but mama, you like women and you like men, you like people. And that's ultimately where I landed. Like I'm pansexual. I just like people. Like if your energy is good and like you're just attractive to me in these different ways, like I like you. And it took me, and I think that's also where it was a little bit difficult for me to like come into an understanding of who I was, because even within the LGBTQ community, when you're not a monosexual, like there still is a lot of stigma there. And so for those of us who have a desire that falls underneath that bi plus umbrella, which pansexuality like oftentimes is like umbrella there, we don't know that there's place for us because we're not straight, but we're not gay or lesbians. And so we're like, is there really room for us when like people on both sides are saying, well, you're just confused. It's really that you can only be one or the other. And it's just like, but my attraction is different. So let's talk about that, y'all.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. As a baby pansexual, it's been interesting to see that dynamic at play. So do you have what happened for you to feel like, okay, I'm queer, I'm pansexual, and I'm going to be out to myself, at least. Like I'm going to own this. Like how did you get there?
It was definitely a journey over a few years. So it starts with other people. So, I was in my former life, I was an educational advocate working with teens. And, a lot of my kids started coming out as queer. And I would ask, well, when they share this with me, it's like, we talk about everything. Like, what would take you so long to share this? Because for some, it took a while. And they shared pretty universally, well, you're, the most religious person we know. And so we needed to make sure that like you wouldn't leave us. And so it made me start asking like what was happening within the church. It's like, yo, if we're supposed to be about the love of God, why do like literal children fear abandonment? And I interpreted that as violence and then had to do that reckoning in myself. It's just like, is this really what the gospel calls us to? No? Okay. So like it just that started the shift theologically and also politically for me. because I would see things like, the fight for marriage equality, and started asking like myself some really deep questions. It's like, even if I'm in a place of these not being my views, it's like, what right do I have as a voter to keep people from living their best lives when it doesn't have any bearing on me? And so like these things were a part of, my evolution. And then at some point I had to ask the question of, as my advocacy grew and as like some of those things around LGBTQ sinfulness like went away from me, as I started like studying scripture and looking for like resources so I could better support the students who I was working with, I started asking I just started asking more questions of the text. And then honestly, a big shift in me that eventually let me come out, I had like a mystical experience.
Ooh.
I will totally share
I'm
if you're
gonna
down.
lean in now.
So I I was not LGBTQ affirming back then, so that I wasn't out to myself. But I remember out of nowhere feeling this intense desire to go volunteer at New York City Pride. And I'm just like,
Mm.
what? Like, God, these people are sinners. And even if I can respect their rights, like, why would I go there? Blah, 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 blah. So, and I could not shake it. And like, I'm at the point where like I understand that the Holy Spirit is anointed enough where she will like consistently get my attention until we have a conversation and work some stuff out. Well, in our working out, I went to the volunteer event, the orientation, and like saw people who, the likes of whom I've never seen before. Like, this was totally outside the realm of my little conservative bubble, even living in New York. And I'm like, okay, this is a different world. Okay, but everyone was so sweet. Like, that was one of the things that like got me. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like there is just such kindness here. And then when Pride came around, I went to the parade first and then the event that I was volunteering at afterwards. And the parade was the most loving, affirming, non gross parade I'd ever been to in New York. Like, there was nobody getting like felt up or fondled. People were there with their kids. It was just very wholesome in a way that I hadn't anticipated because of all of, again, the bias that's projected into these conservative spaces about how like salacious, LGBTQ people are. And I just saw people just really embodying love, and that extended into like the volunteer space that I was in. And there was just such care and empathy that was there, but I also had a little bit of a window into the pain, um just people sharing stories and what have you. And so I remember like towards the end of the night after my shift ended, I was just hanging out with some queer girls, and we were just talking about relationship stuff, and I was just talking to them like I would talk to my homies. And a lady passes by and gives me this rainbow flag, and I sort of absentmindedly put it in my ponytail and just kept on talking. And so I go home and I'm waiting on the train and I'm on the subway platform. And then I hear these, like a group of like young women. It's just like, oh my God, like, who does she think she is? Like, flaunting her sexuality, yada, yada, yada. And they were just talking like pure trash. And I was like, who are they talking about like that? Like, what the hell? Like, why would, and I realized, oh my God, they're talking about me. And clear as day, Ash, I heard the Holy Spirit say, and this is how my beloved feel. When
Oh
I
my
tell
God.
you, I started to wail, like, just with it finally having an understanding. It was a supernatural one, that this is what LGBTQ people go through by having something that marks them as different, and people making all these assumptions about their personhood and about who they are and what they contribute, and what they believe and what they don't, and what they do and what they don't. And I just fell apart and I cried for hours, hours. And that was the day that I became LGBTQ affirming, like full stop, full period. And eventually that led me to embrace that acceptance for myself.
I don't goosebump easily. Maybe it's that I'm on estrogen now, but I'm goosebumping. And that's such a beautiful, that's such a great, I mean, it's heavy. It's not a
Mhm.
light and fluffy thing, but
Mhm.
it's a beautiful and powerful story. And like I like to tell people, if it ain't subversive, it ain't the spirit. And to
Mhm.
me, what a subversive moment.
Mhm.
I love that so
Just
much.
on the train platform, the spirit spoke and I heard loud and clear, and I've been different ever since. I think that was 20. 13. Yeah. That was like June 2013. And I haven't looked back. And yeah, it took me a few more years. It took me about another 2 years full on to and actually having an encounter with somebody who I couldn't like shake. Like I just kept running into them and I'm like, oh, I can't deny this attraction. Oh no, oh no. Yeah, you're queer. You're very, very queer.
Very queer.
And that was about 2 years later.
So thank you for sharing that story.
Absolutely.
You and you don't have to answer this, but you said you had your dad's permission to share that story earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Has things shifted with your family?
To some degrees.
Okay.
So one of the things that my dad and I talked about, this is a few years ago. So actually me coming out, it was very much an intentional thing. Um, because I do ministry, because of just the access that I have in the world, it was really important for me to be able to like never hide this part of who I am because I wish I would have seen a me back in the day because this would have given me hope that like a life like mine is possible. Like I'm happy, I have an awesome fiance, I have friendships that like sustain and like nourish my soul. And it's because of, my queerness and my living freely. And so I wanted to model that for other folks who come from places like where I come from. But with my dad in particular, you know, it was a struggle. Like when I'm telling you, my father, when I first tried to come out, like as an adult, not as a kid, but it was just like, well, show me in the Bible where it says this and contextualize this. And so we're like getting into scripture and theology around things. And it was hard and contentious. But I remember things sort of began shifting for my dad in 2016. So this is like right before I came out publicly. So my dad knew shortly after I knew in 2015 that I was queer. But my dad met my partner at the time and really liked them. And then saw some of the advocacy work that I was doing in the world and started hearing people's stories more. And that was the thing that started changing him because as he built relationships, and this is where like I kind of get frustrated when people say like relationships don't change things. They absolutely do. When my dad actually came into contact with other queer folks and people whose like integrity he did not question and whose love he felt, it was so palpable. He's like, he shared, he would be crestfallen if anything happened to them because of people's bias and bigotry. And to the point where, like, I would hear from his friends, like, somebody said something homophobic in the friends group and your dad like went off on them. And so it's definitely been a journey for him. And it's, him having 50 some odd years of formation as a person and having these gender and sexual constructs being kind of, foisted off on him that he's working to undo. But like my dad told me a few years ago, like, you're my kid and I love you, so you're worth that work. And so, he was probably one of the happiest people for me when he found out that my fiance and I were getting married, like when we got engaged. I mean, there was just such delight in his voice in ways that quite honestly, we didn't have from my mom. And, she's still on her journey. And like, a lot of it is because of like the theological baggage. Like, when you're raised in a space that you feel like God will judge you and you face potential damnation if you accept this. I mean, I get how it could take you a while. I mean, and I know that that's part of the thinking because my father, on his road to working to accept me and love me more fully, um, he shared like he didn't want to lose God's respect. Like flat out, he said that. He's like, I don't want to lose God's respect. I don't want to have to deal with that consequence. And this is why I'm struggling. But that's no longer a thing for him because he sees evidence of God in me and in my life and trusts God in my journey in a way that I don't think he did before.
I'm glad you brought up the relationship piece. I mean, I'm thinking back to, every step of the way, I don't think I could have made the next step without knowing people who confronted my assumptions and expectations in ways that were very and it wasn't like sitting across the table and having debates. I mean, so I think a lot of people are right in saying you can't argue someone into it, and that's what they think relationship means. But for me, meeting lesbian couples that seemed like they were better at marriage than me was like, well, I can't just say that that's less than God's ideal, because they're closer to God's ideal than I am. So clearly there's, at the time I would have still seen it as sinful, but I'm like, well, at least there's layers to it. And if someone is maybe technically sinning in one area, but they're somehow learning how to grow deeper in love in a, in a Jesus-y way with this person, then I can't say it's just bad. And then I was like, well, maybe it's not that it's just not bad. Maybe it's actually good. And then like things like that. And it's all because of meeting these different people who challenged that helped me, made me want to be a better Christian. That really did it. And so then I realized like there's gifts there. And so I'm wondering, so as and you've already kind of spoken around this, and I just want to make it explicit with the question.
Yeah.
How did this experience of owning your queerness change your understanding of your faith?
Oh, I'm way closer to God. I'm not scared of God anymore. Like part of embracing my identity as a queer person and my queerness, and specifically my queer theology and politics, means that there are things that I relinquished that had to do with control and boundaries that that's not a part of my framework anymore. Like I no longer believe in hell. And that was a game changer. But that comes with me embracing queerness, and also like embracing and working to trust scripture in new ways. Like that verse that talks about like God not having a desire for any to be apart from them. I was like, well, what if that's actually true? Like, what if that's true for real, God? And there's something that you do that's redemptive for us all. Like, what if that's real? But that comes because I was willing to be daring in ways that that I wasn't wholly willing to do when I wasn't living in the fullness of who I was. And I'm also not afraid of ministry anymore. Like there's nothing like there's like all these parts of myself I feel like I suppressed, and like when I came out as being queer, it's just like, okay, like I can reconcile these things now, right? Like I would have never, Ash, ever thought that I would like proudly tell people like, oh yeah, I'm a minister and I'm working towards ordination. Like what? I mean, I'm a pastor's kid and like a multi-generational minister, but like it's not a life that I wanted for myself, because I saw a very like kind of narrow categorization of what ministers looked like. And queerness lets me know that ministry can look like something very different. Like I don't have to do this like my dad and like great-great-grandfather or whomever else in my family, chosen or biological do. Like my ministry looks different because my life looks different, as it should.
It's interesting. Like I'm loving what you're bringing up, because I have noticed within myself, like the more in different areas, and more like I can really embrace the things about myself that don't conform to social expectation. The less I'm operating from a place of self-hatred, unless that is informed, like finds its way into my ministry. So like, of course, if you're mostly worried about fucking it up and doing things wrong, and you feel inept and inadequate, and that like God is working in spite of you, then it's really hard to really unleash and enjoy it.
Absolutely.
And then that means that you're being actually ended up counterintuitively maybe being stingy with the gift of God in the world. But when you're like, I'm just going to be bold because God is in this, and I don't have to be perfect, but there's healing. Like I can just unleash it all. And it reminds me of a story, and it may have even come from you. I remember hearing this story, maybe it didn't, but it seems like something you might share, about giving a talk at a church and someone coming up afterwards and saying like, well, if you remove the idea of hell from your presentation of the gospel, what's the point? And the person responded saying something like, well, do you think there's anything positive about the gospel? And the person kind of went away kind of confused. And I think this whenever I heard this story, it kind of
Mm-hmm.
like, well, yes. I mean, this is the thing. Like somehow queerness opens up the more of the possibility of the good news.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can God be present in these ways that I would have thought of as off limits
Mm-hmm.
before?
And for people who like think that faith is off limits for them, like one of my points of pride, like when I look at like my little social media feeds, is that I see like people of like all these different spiritual traditions and sex workers and like really like religious people and like folks who don't give a damn about the church, but like finding affirmation in the things that I say because like my queerness means that I'm open to them all. I'm open to it all. Like I'm open up to being with people and hearing their stories and like yes, holding people to standards like where they embody an ethic of care, but also where I'm not trying to be some judgmental asshole. And like that's the thing that came away when I stepped into my queerness. Like there's a lot of judginess that came when I was trying to like fit within like a particular like sexual ethic,
Mm-hmm.
specifically like where I was cosplaying being like a straight woman. Like it just wasn't real. And so like when you're not real
Yeah.
and like this is like performance, even if you're not recognized and that's the case, right? Like it took me a long time to like be like, oh no, you're actually not a straight woman. But like there are just all these things that you're not able to do or imagine or conceive of. And I think that's what it comes back to. It's about having like an imagination where you can imagine that the love of God and that the family of God can extend to all of these people
Mm-hmm.
and that like you can be in community with them. And I think that that's part of like the dope part about like about queerness and faith is that yeah, like my queerness lets me see that the love of God is really expansive and I see the fruit, right? We talk about the fruit of the spirit within Christianity, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, all that funness. Like I see evidence of that fruit in people because queerness has taken the shackles off really of who I can be and how I need to be.
I have one last question for you
Mm-hmm.
before you go, and it's it's the time travel question. Like, if you could go back to a younger point in your life,
Mm-hmm.
when would you go back, and what would you tell yourself? And before you answer,
Mm-hmm.
every time I ask this, people do the thing where like, well, if I go back and change things, then I'm not who I am anymore, so I wouldn't go back and change a thing. Don't
Mm-hmm.
do that. Like, just at least
I'm,
entertain the question.
I'm tempted. So I've been watching DC's Legends of Tomorrow, and like it deals
Okay.
with time travel, and so
Yeah.
I was like, wait, where can I go where I won't affect myself too much? Um,
I I I've thought about time travel a lot, and it's
mm,
always that's always what ruins the fun of it, is like knowing that you could mess up future things for
mm.
yourself.
So I think if I could go back, and this is going to be, um, it's whatever. I'm not going to qualify it. If I could go back to any point in my time in my life, I would probably go back to college. Um, like my late teens, early 20s, um, because having a more conservative sexual ethic, like I was like a purity culture failure, right? I'm like, I was in being in the conservative world that I was in, I was part of purity culture. I was taught like abstinence until marriage, but I like sucked at it, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
just like I was like, my friends would call me a virgin. They're like, you do everything but like have penetrative sex, like, which was true. And the reason why I say I would go back to that time in life is because I would encourage myself to figure out what my sexual ethics were so I wouldn't feel so conflicted about having this sex drive and doing these things with folks, but also experiencing intense shame around it. I mean, quite frankly, I also would have kissed a lot more girls. Like, I went to a women's college. It was like a waste on me because I, at least in the regard of like being able to form like those sort of exploratory relationships where you figure out and unpack your desires. Like, I didn't have that because, again, repression was so much a part of my story back then. And so I would go back to that point in my life and just encourage myself to be ethical, but be a lot more sexually free than what I was.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for this great conversation, and I'll follow up with you on the other thing, that the bookmarked conversation
Let's do
sometime.
it. Let's do
Yeah.
it. No, thank you for having me on. I really
Yeah.
appreciate this. These were super good questions.
Great. Thank you. And thanks for answering so openly. And I know that once this goes out, I'll share the link and everything. And I don't know how many people will watch these, but I know it'll matter because, like you said, like having these examples of people in ministry who are really into Jesus, into spirituality, like who don't feel this conflict. In fact, their queerness helps them go deeper. I think a lot of people need to hear that, especially youngins who are in all girl colleges.
Yes. Yes. They do. Absolutely do.
Thank you.
Thank you.